Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, we talked to Roger Eddy, Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Boards, about their preparation for the potential of schools not opening in lieu of the state budget crisis. Then in about 20 minutes from now, at a luncheon hosted by the State University's Annuitants Association, Charles Wheeler, a public affairs reporting professor at the University of Illinois Springfield, discusses the politics behind the budget standoff in Springfield. And finally, in about 1 hour and 10 minutes from now, we attend a panel at the City Club of Chicago on Chicago's homicide crisis. Speakers include Eddy Johnson, the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, and Reverend Michael Flager, the pastor at St. Sabina's Church. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our advisory council members.
Hi, I'm Tony Pulowski, Executive Director for the Arc of Illinois. We fight for the rights and needs for 220,000 infants, children, and adults with intellectual and other developmental disabilities and their families. With a bit of support, people with developmental disabilities can live a full life in the community. This is accomplished in a variety of ways, such as being included in their neighborhood schools alongside their non-disabled friends, being supported to live in their own homes instead of being locked away in institutions. Diversity makes our community better. And the good news, doing the right thing, investing in community supports, also saves taxpayers money. In fact, it costs taxpayers about half as much to support people with disabilities in community homes where they're better cared for than it costs to have them housed in institutions. Advancing positive public policy by supporting the development of community services best serves the needs of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This is our greatest goal. Developing inclusive communities so everyone can live a full life in the community. That's why I'm so proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council. At its core, politics is about people and their needs, and the Illinois Channel's coverage of our issues allow us to tell the story of people with disabilities and their families, not in a quick soundbite, but in full, unedited interview in which our parents can tell their story, what they want for their child with a disability, and why they were concerned about what the state was doing. Isn't that the kind of coverage we all want of politics? Coverage that ties us to the issues that really matter and in a way that doesn't shortchange the ability of those impacted to get their message out. I'm Tony Pulowski, Executive Director of the Arc of Illinois and a proud member of the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council. The Illinois Channel, it keeps us connected to the issues that matter the most.
Next, from Springfield, we talked to Roger Eddy, Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Boards, about their preparation for the potential of schools not opening in lieu of the state budget crisis. This runs about 15 minutes.
Roger Eddy, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. As we are here in the middle of June, we have 2 weeks left before the new fiscal year, and at this point it doesn't look like we're going to have a budget. We shall see. Last year, as people may know, there was at least a budget passed. The governor signed the education funding bill so the schools could open. That isn't the case this year. So we wanted to talk to you about how are people who are involved in the running of the schools coping in this environment where when schools are going to be supposed to be reopening in 6 weeks or so, 7 weeks, they don't know if they're going to have the ability to open or have any funding. What's going on behind the scenes relative to your organization, the Association of School Boards, and how you're operating in this environment?
Well, I mean, depending on the district, the crisis is going to hit differently. There are districts that are not as dependent on state funding as other districts, and for some of those districts, although it's causing them obviously to have to spend some of their reserves and rely on local funding more, they're not hit as severely. if your district is heavily reliant on state aid, and the proration has caused you to spend down your reserves, which has happened in a lot of those same districts over the last several years, they're facing the real possibility of, if they can open, not being open long, and in some cases, not even being able to reasonably be expected to open their doors this fall. So depending on where you are, it's hitting schools differently, but certainly we're concerned, and we've been working to provide school districts with some tools so they can begin to engage with their community to discuss what their options are based on their unique circumstances.
So what kind of tools would they have? And obviously, if it's a school that has the funds, they can operate. There's no necessarily a problem, or at least it's not a crisis. What are you doing, or how are you working with those districts that say, you know, we don't know if we can open our doors, or if we do open our doors, we may not be able to go past October?
Well, we're urging them to do a pretty deep analysis of their current cash reserves and to determine exactly how far into the year they might be able to go and still maintain some type of secure district as far as liability and keeping buildings in maintenance condition and honoring contracts that they have. So school districts have different types of funds, and funds are not available. Some are very restricted. So we're asking them to do that analysis and really kind of make the best guess that they can based on if they have reserves, what those reserves are, and whether they can be used, and also when local tax money might come in. That varies around the state as well. So all those cash flow issues, we hope they bring to their public, and they tell their story and show the public that, look, this is the day we think we can no longer, without that state aid we're reliant on, continue to provide students an education. It's going to vary from district to district. As I mentioned, some are in such dire financial straits that they may not be able to open. Some are going to have to open late. Some might be able to open and only go a certain number of days. All that uncertainty weighs on everyone in those districts. And in fact, in cases we're hearing students are beginning to wonder about their senior year, for example. Parents are wondering about that first day of kindergarten for their child, and that is really difficult conversations that our districts are having with their communities.
Well, yeah, I mean, as people who are watching this, they're going to have children in school. If those kids are not in school, that's going to put an enormous financial burden on parents if they have to go out and spend several $100s every week for someone to watch their kids while the parents go to work, and where the kids will otherwise be off in school. So is the teachers, the payroll of the schools, and I'll remind the audience that the Illinois Association of School Boards is on the management side, the running of the schools. The teachers would be the labor, you might say. Is there any discussion going on with any of the teachers' unions to say, look, you know that this is not our doing. Everyone knows the cause has nothing to do with the way the schools are managed. It's a legislative issue. Is there any discussion with the schools to say, hey, we would want to open, we want to keep your people employed, maybe we can pay them a partial salary or something to stretch the dollars until we get a budget, or are we not at that point yet?
Well, it depends on the district. I think in some districts they're probably having those conversations. Most districts, that are facing this have collective bargaining agreements that have to be honored to some degree. I know that if you don't have any money and your district has operated and spent every single last dollar and borrowed and have tax anticipation warrant capabilities used up, you get to the point where there isn't anything except maybe script or paper to give teachers, these like an IOU, and those are the type of conversations that unfortunately may have to happen in some districts as to whether or not. But a school business district is a large enterprise, from transportation to buying diesel fuel to buying food to paying electricity costs. All of those things have to be considered, and the districts that are in the most severe financial shape aren't going to be able to make those payments either. So it's not just a matter of paying people, it's keeping benefits, health insurance, making sure that your employees are taken care of. And districts are facing those very real circumstances right now.
Yes, it's interesting you say that because almost all of us forget that what an economic enterprise any school is. And you're going to be looking at what over like $10 to $20 million, depending upon district and up. I mean, if you think of a small business doing $10 million, you would go, well, that's a pretty nice little business. What is like an average budget for a district? And I know it's going to go all over the board, but on the low end to the high end, what kind of a range is it?
Well, there are districts in the state that have, operating budgets of $3 million or less. There are districts in the state that operate over $100 million. So it is all over the board. You're right, but the proportionate economic impact to the community would be the same, I think, in a district that counts on the revenue of a $3 million budget to have folks buy groceries and make car payments and mortgage payments. And they are really, truly a significant portion of the economic engine of a community. And we saw what happened with higher ed last year in some of the communities that were affected by the higher ed funding crisis. There were businesses affected. So this is something that goes very, very deep, and that's why I think it's important that boards and administrators have that discussion with their community so that the members in that community realize the impact that this could have on their entire community, and those folks get engaged in this process and become advocates for some type of solution for this funding crisis.
You were a member of the House of Representatives, a Republican member of the House of Representatives for a number of years, so you are very familiar with the way it operates, with the personalities. What's your best guess of what's going on there? And, the governor's hoping that he can pick off a couple of Democratic votes to say, look, let's pass a clean funding bill at least through January so the schools can open. In your estimation, is there any chance of that happening, or is it going to be where until Speaker Madigan decides to play ball with the governor, we're going to be stuck in this land of limbo and no funding?
Well, no, I think there's a chance that they could come to a compromise. I, as you mentioned, know a lot of these folks and know that they want to do the right thing, and I know that they also have some very deep felt philosophical differences related to issues, and they also have a revenue issue as to not having enough revenue for all of the needs, and so all of those things have to be examined. Money needs to be real, and the main thing right now for K-12, pre-K through 12 education is that some type of an appropriation bill get passed that would fund schools for the year. I've heard about the stopgap, the 6-month, those types of things, and that would concern me from a school standpoint because schools are year-long enterprises. Collective bargaining agreements with teachers are a year long. When you buy fuel and bread and milk and those types of items for your district and you go into a bid agreement, it's for the whole year. School districts have certain statutes that they operate under that are kind of unique to them. For example, for all school districts outside of the city of Chicago, last March or April was the time that they would have had to lay people off for the fall. There's a requirement that you do it prior to the end of the school year. So those decisions have already been made. And again, stopgap budgets don't really allow you the confidence to call people back for a full year if you want to. A lot of districts call people back that have been reduced, waiting to see if funding comes through. They're waiting longer this year because the funding has not come through. So, I'm still hopeful that some of the folks that are involved in this process will come up with some type of compromise to get us through this school year while some of the other issues are resolved.
Let's move on just to another issue. Under George Bush, we had the No Child Left Behind. We were trying to establish, as I would interpret that law, a base level of performance so that we could decide what schools are failing the students, et cetera. As with any change, there's a lot of controversy. There's now been a new federal law passed, as I understand it, supplanting that law. What is it, and what would it do differently?
Well, in December, Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, approved the new federal education authorization bill, and it's called, well, the name that's given is ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. There's got to be a really neat little name for these, No Child Left Behind to Every Student Succeeds. And the purpose of that is to lay out the parameters for use of federal funding to make sure that students in the most need, the Title I students especially, as well as some other federal programs, receive funding, and that the funding is used in a manner that meets certain goals. And one of those has to do with accountability, and you pointed that out. What the changes are supposed to include is kind of a shift to state and local authority related to accountability measures, and Illinois is now.
Does that mean some more control at the local level rather than federal?
Well, let's hope so. I mean, that was the intent. I was just in Washington, D.C. at a National Advocacy Institute for the School Board Association last week, and there is some concern the Department of Education may be overreaching into those areas that the leaders felt were local and state control type areas. Senator Lamar Alexander, who was the lead Senate sponsor of the legislation, is now very concerned that the Department of Education is overreaching a little bit from what the agreement was. So we're watching it very closely. We're working with the State Board of Education. They've had some listening tours around the state, one round, to try and get input, because the law does require input from stakeholders, a wide array of stakeholders, while the state determines its plan for this new federal law. And there is a lot more flexibility for the state and local school districts. So we're encouraged by that, but it's one of those things that we have to really kind of keep our eye on to make sure that the intent is carried out.
You know, a couple of years ago I talked to one administrator, and he said federal funds are about 3% of our annual budget and about 95% of our annual headaches. In this presidential campaign, I think I'm right that Mr. Trump, I don't mean to have you pick sides on it, but as an issue, should we have a federal Department of Education, or is it just one more layer of bureaucratic nightmare? Or should we just have, look, let's, run schools at the local level and do it that way?
Well, I think there's a place for protection of civil rights related to students who are disabled, and making sure that those students have some quality of education. The history of the country indicates that something was necessary at one point. I think that should be limited, though, to that area. I think all of the other decisions related to how best use those funds be made at the state and local level. If there's a civil rights issue, then let's keep it as a civil rights issue. Let's not let the civil rights issue part of this begin to erode the control of local boards of education related to other issues involved in education. Local control is really kind of the cornerstone of public education in Illinois. Our communities are different across the state of Illinois. You can imagine the difference across the country. To try and have a national policy that takes into account all of those differences and do this one-size-fits-all doesn't make sense. Now, it does make sense to make sure that for the most vulnerable, that there are some programs to protect them. Special education, IDEA, was set up for that reason. The funding is woefully underfunded.
I'm sorry, what is IDEA?
The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that was passed in 1972. And the reason for that was to make sure that those most vulnerable students had access to quality education. There was a 40% funding promise made when that was passed. Last year it was funded at about 16%. We're used to that in education. However, that is the role that I believe the Federal Department of Education has some business being in. I don't believe it has business being in the school district's curricular matters. Every school district's different. What is working to support local jobs and college and career pathways in Southern Illinois may be different than the suburbs, may be different than the city, but the point is those best equipped to make the decisions are locally elected members of boards of education who are answered to the citizens in a democracy. So that's what we believe, and we'd like to see that authority handed down. We also understand that there's an appropriate role for the federal government, especially related to civil rights.
All right. Well, Roger, Eddy, we appreciate you joining us.
Well, anytime. Thank you, Terry.
Next, from Springfield, at a luncheon hosted by the State University's Annuitants Association, Charles Wheeler, a public affairs reporting professor at the University of Illinois Springfield, discusses the politics behind the budget standoff in Springfield. This runs about 45 minutes.
I'd like to introduce Charlie Wheeler, And he's going to give you a little bit of his perspective about what's going on in Springfield. It's hard to sort out, folks, but I know that Charlie has a grip on it, and he's got years of experience to tell you just what that is.
Thank you, Linda, for that glowing introduction. Does anybody hear me okay? Well, as Linda said, I've been watching state government since Richard Ogilvie was a newbie governor. Yeah, grown. Luckily, there are some of you who are experienced enough to remember that, unlike my students for whom that ancient history. Yeah. Back with the Egyptians and the Romans and so on. So I've been watching this stuff since 1969. I was a reporter for the Sun-Times for 24 years. Michael Madigan and I started together, so to speak. His first elected office was as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. That was my first major assignment for the Sun-Times. And then I've been at the university since the fall of '93. And my program prepares students to be reporters. Roughly half of the current Capitol Press Corps are graduates of my program. Any given day, I can pick up the Chicago Tribune and see bylines, 2 or 3 of people who've gone through my program. So I've been focused on this for a long time. And let me tell you, from all of those years of observing state government, it's given me absolutely no preparation, no insight for what we're living through now. So to give you quite a bit of insight on the spring legislative session, so I will try to do that, but as I say, it's like being in a whole new world, all this other experience where you could kind of say, okay, this is kind of like what's going to happen. Doesn't count for anything anymore. It's kind of scary. The governor gave his own appraisal of the legislative session the day that, I guess it was the day after lawmakers adjourned on May 31st. He referred to it as a stunning failure. And it probably was, but let me just mention a few things that didn't get highlighted, but which could be looked at as being accomplishments. One of the things that the state did, or the legislature sent a bill to the governor to do, and the governor's indicated he'll probably sign it, was to extend the trial period for a medical marijuana law and to add another couple of other conditions, one of which is post-traumatic stress disorder, which will benefit people greatly, I think, particularly veterans who've gone through the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So that went to the governor. There's also legislation, again, the governor has indicated he'll probably sign it, to decriminalize possession of small amounts of marijuana. The notion being that somebody who's caught with a few grams of pot shouldn't have a criminal record that would impede their ability to go on, qualify for a lot of professions, get different licenses, and so on. There's also legislation for automatic voter registration. So when someone shows up for their driver's license or shows up at some state agency, they will be registered to vote, which is seen as a way to increase participation in our democracy. Although I have to say, being registered doesn't necessarily guarantee that people will show up at the polls. But it's good to have the opportunity to register people. There is legislation to say that folks who are part-time members of county boards no longer qualify for pensions, which was a reform that was spearheaded out of McHenry County up in the northern part of the state. There's another legislation headed to the governor that would that basically eliminate the sales tax on feminine hygiene products, the so-called pink tax. And then there was another one that had bipartisan support to increase penalties for people who are gun traffickers, which is a real problem in the Chicago area. Guys who will go across the state line to Indiana, buy a bunch of guns, bring them back into Chicago, and peddle them on the street. So those are all positive things that the General Assembly did. And so if you want to analyze the session in a more complete fashion, you have to look at those accomplishments. Now, that said, I'll get into ripping them. The major task of a governor and a General Assembly each spring is to prepare a budget, a spending plan that allocates the state's resources to cover the services and goods that the governor and legislators believe constituents want. Every governor from 1818 all the way through Rod Blagojevich and Pat Quinn managed to get that done. Now, up until Ogilvy's time, we had biennial budgets. So the legislature would come in January of the odd-numbered year, pass a budget for 2 years, go home. Ogilvy moved us on to annual budgets. Every year since then, we've prepared a budget that's been passed, signed into law, and the state has moved accordingly. That didn't happen a year ago. And so for the first time in state history, we've operated to this point no authorized spending plan for the entirety of state government. Now, this fiscal year ends on June 30th at the stroke of midnight. Fiscal 17 begins. There is no budget in place for fiscal 17 either. So in that sense, the legislative leadership and Governor Rauner have been failures of, what would you say, of unprecedented sorts. As a matter of fact, there's been no state in the history of this nation that's gone a full year without a budget. And we're, 9 days away from that. Part of the problem, I think, is the folks who are responsible for this know what has to be done. They just don't have the courage to do it. And they want to blame the other guy for when it happens. So I've said on occasion, it's an example of profiles in cowardice. What needs to be done is we have to raise taxes, we have to cut spending, and we have to kind of dig ourselves out of the hole that we're in. I checked the comptroller's website before I came out here, and we're roughly have a bill backlog of roughly $7.9 billion, where the bills are there on Leslie Munger's desk, and she doesn't have the cash to be able to write the check to cover them. Some vendors are waiting close to a year, some of them even more, to have the state pay for the things that they in good conscience provided to the state. And because of the late fees we're having to pay on this stuff, we've run up like $1 billion over the last, since the turn of the century, late fees because we can't pay people on time. So we know what needs to be done, but we've not been able to do it. Now, Governor Rauner blames the Democrats, says, not giving me a balanced budget. The fact of the matter is Governor Rauner has yet to propose a balanced budget. The one he proposed a year ago, February, was out of whack by roughly $3.5 billion. By law, the governor is supposed to prepare a spending plan based on what the statutes say today, not what the statutes might say if I can change them. And he's supposed to use the revenues that are coming in as of today, not what they might be if I can jiggle the law to accomplish some things. So if you may recall, the governor decided he was going to save a couple $2 billion by, quote, pension reform, by in essence shorting people benefits. I'm sure you guys are more aware of it than I am. And he also was going to save like $800 million by shorting the money that local governments receive as part of the state's income tax collections. Part of the deal in 1969 that led us to have an income tax was Mayor Daley and Governor Ogilvy, Daley a Democrat, Richard J., Ogilvy a Republican, actually were able to negotiate. They were able to work out a deal for the income tax. Daley had Democratic lawmakers vote for the Republican governor's income tax bill, and in return, the city of Chicago, the county of Cook, other cities and counties across the state got a slice of the revenues from this new income tax. And that's been on the books ever since. And Governor Rauner decided we'll just keep a big chunk of it, roughly half of it. But to do that, you have to change the law. So that budget was out of whack. Democrats passed a budget with no new revenues that was about $4 billion out of whack. They at least admitted, yeah, we didn't pony up the money to cover this, but this is what we think we ought to spend. This last February, the governor put forward a budget that proposed spending roughly $3.5 billion more than what this would be. And how did he cover it? He put a line in there, make sure I get this right. It was government management and savings for $3.5 billion without spelling out exactly what was in there. So that was kind of funny, I thought. So neither side has clean hands in this situation. Before the legislature adjourned, the House sent a budget plan to the Senate, or I should back up. Despite the fact that there's no spending plan in place, no total budget enacted for this current fiscal year, we've been spending money left and right, roughly at 90% of what the levels were in fiscal 15. And the reason we're doing that is because certain things by law get paid, even if the legislature doesn't appropriate a single nickel. For example, contributions to the 5 public employee retirement systems for which the state is the employer and by law makes the employer's contribution. Teachers' retirement being the biggest one. I'm not sure if university retirement or state employees is the next biggest, but the state makes those payments. And the way the law is written, even if the legislature doesn't appropriate a nickel, the comptroller automatically sends the money to the retirement systems. Same things with debt service. We borrow money, the people who buy our bonds get paid, regardless of whether there's an appropriation or not. So that money goes out, whatever. Over the course of the last several decades, we've also been sued in federal court by various groups, basically advocacy groups for people relying on human services, saying that the federal law says you have to do this. State of Illinois, you're not doing it. And the state has said, well, we won't admit that we haven't been doing it, but we'll do it in the future. And they sign these consent decrees. And so that money flows no matter what. And a big, what would you say, development was when a circuit judge in St. Clair County said state employees have to be paid. Doesn't matter whether there's any appropriation for it, they still have to be paid. Now, there were kind of arcane reasons behind that, one of which is that under federal law, some people would have to get minimum wage, and our records are so antiquated, we can't tell who falls into that category. And so we don't really know who qualifies under the federal law. What are we going to do? And the judge says, okay, just pay everybody. And so that's where we are. And so those kinds of, what would you say, statutory provisions, those kinds of consent decrees, those kinds of court orders, plus the governor did sign one piece of the budget. He signed funding for elementary and secondary education. All of that stuff we're at the rate of roughly $36 billion a year. We have roughly $32 billion coming in. So right away you see that there's a problem. And that's what needs to be addressed, and it hasn't been. And it's been sort of a blame game, and it's going to get worse if we don't get something done by June 30th, because over the course of the last year, particularly in the most recent months, legislature has done some piecemeal stuff. They passed legislation saying, okay, agencies, you can spend the federal dollars that you get. Even though we don't have a full budget, you can spend the federal dollars. They've told, excuse me, the General Assembly has put together some emergency money to help some other agencies survive and get by. We finally, at long last, gave a pittance to higher education. Roughly 30% of higher education would get in a normal year. And it may not be enough to save some of our schools. Eastern in particular is in jeopardy, Chicago State, Western. But all of those emergency things, the federal money, higher ed money, money for human services, all of that stuff, the authority to spend ends when the clock strikes 12 on June 30th. And so that is going to be a pressure point. I mentioned earlier the governor signed a budget for elementary and secondary education. If there's, and again, that authority ends on June 30th. If there's no budget for the next fiscal year, will schools be able to open on time? Big question. They're already talking about how road projects are going to be delayed. There was a news conference with a group called the Transportation for Illinois Coalition, which is made up of the business community and organized labor that's urging the state to invest more in infrastructure, roads, bridges, and so on. The authority to spend money for ongoing projects ends on June 30th. So the Department of Transportation is warning we're just going to have to shut everything down if we don't get any more spending authority. So that's kind of the situation in which we find ourselves. And so we're playing a blame game. The governor on the one hand says, I'm not going to do a budget unless I get my turnaround agenda, which the Democrats say, well, those pro-business changes you want are going to hurt working people. You do away with the prevailing wage, yeah, maybe local governments can save money on projects, but on the other hand, the folks who actually go out and do the work are going to get paid less. And so you have less money going into your economy and the community. How does that help anybody in the long run? So there's that kind of dialogue going on. The Democrats say, let's do a budget and then we'll negotiate this other stuff. And as I said earlier, everybody knows what needs to be done. We have to raise taxes and we have to make cuts in the programs. Difficulty is that the general public doesn't seem to see it that way. The Paul Simon Institute down at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, does polls periodically. And I guess it was last week they released a study where they've gone back years to see what's the tenor of the people. And their conclusion was, probably not surprisingly, people want more stuff and they don't want to pay for it. And so the political scientists who did this suggested that, well, maybe the public attitude is a problem too. And I would say, yeah, it kind of is, but on the other hand, that's fostered by politicians of both parties who feed them this line of malarkey. Most people are very busy with their lives. They have families, they have jobs, they have to worry about how I'm going to make the mortgage payment, particularly in this climate when middle-class people are being hollowed out. They don't have time to sit down and analyze the ins and outs of the state budget or the state revenue structure. So when somebody tells them, oh yeah, we'll just cut the waste out of government, say, oh yeah, we ought to do that. We ought to cut out that waste. I like to tell people there really isn't a guy in the basement of the State House shoveling $100 bills into a furnace. And there's no line in the budget that says waste, mismanagement, and abuse, $500 million. It doesn't work that way. And if we want these services, we have to be willing to pay for them. If we don't want to pay for them, then we have to agree some of these services we're going to have to cut back on. Now, kind of cynically, from watching this stuff for many years, I came to the conclusion that waste in government is any program from which I don't personally benefit. And so, do I care if there's a DuQuoin State Fair? No. Why should I care? On the other hand, do I care if there's money for elementary secondary education? I do now. I guess I always did, even though I didn't have kids. My kids all went to Catholic schools. My grandkids are in public school. But I always thought that education was a good investment, regardless of whether your kids personally benefited it, because it's good for the community and it's good for society. So I was always a big fan of putting money into education. The governor goes about these negotiations, I think, in the wrong way. Because, as I said, everybody knows what has to be done. People are too busy trying to blame the other guy. So the governor had this tour around the state after the legislature adjourned. First stop was Vienna. And what's his message? Oh, those Chicago Democrats, Mike Madigan, the people controlled by Mike Madigan. Your legislators controlled by Mike Madigan. They want to take money out of Southern Illinois and send it to Chicago. This is a bailout for Chicago schools, and so on and so forth. And he said this in Vienna. And just to be contrary, I actually went to the website of the Illinois State Board of Education, where they have very detailed analyses of every local school district's finances and other things besides, who their kids are, that kind of stuff. And lo and behold, the city of Chicago gets something like 35% of its resources from the state. Vienna gets 45%. Marion, another town that the governor cited, gets 45% too. So I'm thinking to myself, if I were a reporter, I would have put this in the story. And if I were a staffer for the government, I would have made darn sure that the example I'm using was one that was really realistic. Now, there are some school districts that get less than 2% of their money from the state. School districts in Oak Brook, Lake Forest, Kenilworth, Wilmette. And one could argue they're able to provide for themselves a pretty decent education for kids. So the governor is doing this. The governor has badmouthed the legislature and individual leaders. He's referred to Madigan and Cullerton, John Cullerton, the Senate president, as being corrupt, being crooks. He even suggested the Illinois Supreme Court was corrupt. And so one wonders, let's say that we're going to have some negotiation. I might think that you're a jerk, but I'm not going to say to you, man, you're really a jerk. Now let's sit down and see what we can work out. It just doesn't make sense. And he blames Madigan. He says that Madigan's responsible. Madigan's controlled the state for the last 30 years. And I'm thinking, last 30 years, we're 2016 minus 30, that'd be 1986. Who was governor in 86? Oh, yeah, it was Jim Thompson. Did Jim Thompson feel he was controlled by Mike Madigan? And fast forward to the 90s, when Jim Edgar was governor, Pate Phillip was the Senate president. I don't know if any of you remember Pate Phillip. If you've ever met him, you'd never forget him. And I've suggested to reporters, you ought to call up Pate and ask him if he thought he was a tool of Mike Madigan. Now, the response you get, you would not be able to air or put into a family newspaper, but the gist of it would be no. And you look at Madigan's record of working with past Republican governors. Most of the time Madigan's been Speaker, there's been a Republican governor. And most of the time there was a Democratic governor, Madigan was on the outs with him and ultimately impeached the guy. Ask Jim Edgar when he tried to reform the state school aid formula, the most serious effort made in all the years I've been watching this. Mike Madigan pushed Edgar's bill through the General Assembly. It came over to the Senate. Pate Phillip killed it. So the notion that Mike Madigan runs things, I think is not actually true. Now, the governor would like to be the guy who runs things, but in our divided government, you have the executive branch, obviously, legislative branch, judicial branch. The governor controls most of the executive branch. He has to deal as co-equals with the Senate and the House. And as I said, it does not help your cause to be bad-mouthing these people when you're supposed to sit down and negotiate with them. It doesn't help get support for your agenda to be attacking lawmakers across the state as being tools of Mike Madigan. I suspect that people in Southern Illinois who've dealt with Senator Forby, Representative Phelps, Representative Bradley on a daily basis on a lot of issues over time, they hear somebody on the radio or they hear some robocall, he's a tool of Mike Madigan. They're going to dismiss that because they know from their experience that it's not true. But that's kind of the game that's going on. Now, ideally, based, as I said, on my long history of watching this stuff, I'd say, well, what, today's the 21st? We got 9 days. They'll get it done. You know, back when it was people like Edgar, George Ryan, Madigan, or Phil Rock in the Senate, late Phil Rock, God bless him, they were folks who fought tooth and nail at the beginning of the session. About midway through, they'd say, time out on all this partisan nonsense. Let's sit down and work out what we can do for the state of Illinois. And they get something done. I'm not sure that's there. And I think the elements for a compromise exist if people are willing to embrace the notion of reaching a compromise. Now, there are working groups made up of rank and file lawmakers sitting down to hash out some of this stuff, budget stuff, and also some items on the turnaround agenda. Take workers' compensation. There's no reason why some agreement couldn't be made to limit the costs to employers of workers' compensation without undermining the well-being of injured workers. One of the things that I find interesting is that the Illinois Workers' Compensation Commission, which is an agency of the governor, studied the results of reforms that were enacted in 2011, I believe. And it said that as a result of these reforms, not all of which are fully in place, the costs to insurers have gone down 17% in Illinois, the largest drop of any state in the union over that time. The employer community says, hey, we don't see that in our premiums. Democrats suggest, well, maybe we ought to take a look at those premiums and see on what they're based. Maybe there ought to be more review of the insurance companies. That might be an area. Another factor is causation. Employers claim that, well, we just hired Wheeler, and he's 60 years old, and he's spent all his life, you know, using a sledgehammer, and so obviously his wrist and his hands are kind of screwed up. He's worked for us for 6 months, and now he's got a problem with his wrist. Why should we have to pay the full cost of that? And there may be a point there. But on the other hand, you want to say, okay, Wheeler, you're out on your own. Yeah, you dinged yourself up all that time for all these other people, but your latest employer isn't going to pay for that. Maybe what we need to do is do what we do with unemployment insurance. The state runs an unemployment insurance program where employers pay basically two different taxes or fees, whatever you want to call it. One is based on their own employment history. How many people have I laid off over the last, couple years? The other is based on what's the overall climate in the state. So maybe what we could do with workers' compensation is say, okay, the company that has Wheeler last pays a proportion of it. But every company in the state kicks into a fund that's used to make up the difference so that the last employer doesn't get stuck with the whole tab, but the injured employee is made whole. I don't know if that would work, but that's the kind of thing you got to be thinking about. And again, back in the day, that was the kind of issue where representatives of the business community, representatives of organized labor would sit down, hash this stuff all out, and they'd come to the legislative leaders and the governor and say, here's what we agreed on. And it was called an agreed bill process. It would be turned into legislation. It would zip through the House, zoom through the Senate, the governor would sign it, and that would be it. That's how you get this stuff done. And we all know if you're going to raise taxes, you have to look at the income tax. So what you do is you maybe put the income tax back to where it was. Maybe you put a tax on services. Unlike all our neighboring states, we tax very few services. In Wisconsin every summer. Last year when I was up there, the brakes failed on my van. So I went and got them fixed, and I had to pay a service tax. Basically the state sales tax, Wisconsin sales tax, on the labor of the mechanic who fixed my brakes. Here in Illinois, I wouldn't have had to pay that tax on labor, only on the parts. But on the other hand, I didn't want to drive 500 miles with no brakes, so what could I do? But there are things like that. Some of our taxes are high. Our property taxes are very high relative to other states. but it's also because the money we invest at the state level into our schools is towards the bottom, if not being at the absolute bottom of the barrel among states. So yeah, local property taxes are high because the state doesn't do its share of funding elementary and secondary education. And our income tax rates are not exorbitant. Our tax rates are lower, our individual income tax rate is lower than all our neighboring states, save Indiana. And Indiana has a local sales or local income tax on top of the state one. So it's not that our taxes are so high, it's that our revenue structure is kind of out of sync. So you look at the revenues, you decide here's how much money we need to do the essentials that we want to do, and you sit down and you say, okay, we're going to vote for it. Now, people have said, oh, an election year, legislators voting for a tax increase, ooh, that's scary. I would argue it shouldn't be a real concern. One of the reasons I say that is because I actually went back and looked at every roll call for an income tax increase or imposition, going back to 69 with Ogilvy's tax, 83 when Thompson raised it, 89 when we raised it again under Thompson, 90 and 91 when a temporary tax was made permanent under Edgar. And I found out that the people who voted yes for those tax increases or to make permanent the rate actually got reelected at a higher percentage than the people who voted no. And so you might say, that's counterintuitive. Why would that happen? The reason is those were structured roll calls where the party leaders sat down and they said, okay, Republican leader, you're going to put so many yes votes on. Democratic leader, you're going to put so many yes votes on. And so I'm the Republican leader. I look around and say, yeah, you're in a safe district, you'll be yes. Oh, you're a shaky district, you'll be no. You'll be yes, you'll be yes, you'll be a no. And so the people who voted for it were people who were safe. The people who voted no were in shaky districts, and some of them lost. The most recent income tax increase we had, the one that was pushed through with Pat Quinn, that moved us up temporarily to 5%, I went and looked at the results, the next election for those people who voted for it. Of the people who voted yes, one Chicago Democrat lost in the primary, and they were all Democrats, by the way. Everybody else on the ballot won. There were a handful of Republicans who voted no, who lost. So go figure. And what I would say makes the argument even less relevant, I went through the list from the State Board of Elections, candidate filings, and I looked at every district to see who was running. I found out that in the Senate, 19 of the 59 senators are in the middle of a 4-year term, so they're not even on the ballot. So there's 40 that are there. Of that 40, 11 have a challenge. The others have a free ride. All they have to do is show up on election day, vote for themselves, and they're in. That's 7 Democrats and 4 Republicans. So that means you have 48 safe votes. You look at the House, all 118 seats are up. There are 44 with contests, 44 incumbents who face a contest in November. So that means there's 74 who are safe. Now, some of those are people who are going to retire and not running again, so they're like doubly safe. Conceivably, if I vote for it this November, somebody might be ticked off enough and still remember it 2 years from now. But if you're a decent lawmaker, you have 2 years to show the public this is why we did it. And it works with capital projects. Lawmakers, when George Ryan pushed through his Illinois First program for public works, and we raised, what did we raise? We raised the alcohol tax, we raised license fees. People voted for it, and the reason was they could come home and they say, well, I know you don't want to pay more, but on the other hand, you know that high school gym roof that leaked, it's going to be fixed. And you know that road, that frontage road that's turned to oatmeal, it's going to be paved. And people trusted George Ryan to do it, and he did. And so if you explain to people, here's the benefit you get from paying more, you should be able to convince them that it makes sense, or at least enough of them that you're not going to get beaten, particularly if there's nobody running against you. That's about as good as it gets. So anyway, that's my take. Based on my experience, I would think, yeah, we can get it done. Reasonable people sit down, work this stuff out, we all go home. Based on the way things have been positioned, based on the attitude of the governor, based on the recalcitrance of Madigan in particular, to a lesser extent Cullerton, I have my doubts. And part of it is just the attitude. One final anecdote, if you will. You may have noticed that some of the governor's staff people have been very disrespectful to legislators, to the point of being very rude, which again is something new. And I recall years ago, and some of you who are from the Metro East area may recall, there was a state legislator named Wyvetter Young. Does anybody remember Wyvetter? Okay. She was an African-American woman. She was a diligent fighter for her district. She came up with all kinds of economic development plans, some of which were workable, others that weren't, but she was 100% for the district. And she had a question that she posed to the Department of Transportation, and they blew her off, and they were kind of snotty with her. And so, and this was in the spring, and when the Department of Transportation's budget came up in the Illinois House, it received not a single yes vote from either a Republican or Democrat, and Wyvetter was a Democrat. And it was the way of the House to send a message. She may not be in leadership. She may just be a rank-and-file lawmaker. She may be a minority, but by God, she's a member of the Illinois House, and you treat her with respect. And so the Department of Transportation made their apologies, answered her question, and then later on, in the final, like the last day, everything got cleared up, they snuck through a department budget for transportation. That's the kind of respect that I think is missing and that you really need if we're going to get something done. And I guess our role as constituents is to encourage our lawmakers to work together, put aside this partisan bickering, this upstate versus downstate, Chicago versus the rest of the state, and do what's best for the people. So, at this point, if anybody has any questions or any rebuttal, I'd be glad to entertain them. Yeah.
I noticed the governor, in his interview with the Tribune yesterday, referred to the collectivist economy of Illinois, and that whenever he refers to the people of Illinois, it's always as taxpayers, not as citizens, which completely changes the relationship that we have with one another and we have with the collective. And so I'm curious to hear your read. Is anyone talking about that? I've yet to hear anybody talk about the governor's language.
That was the first time I'd heard him use that, but I don't, I'm not with him 24/7, so I don't know. Yeah, it really surprised me, and it maybe reflects where he came from.
He's certainly not appealing to our better angels.
Oh, no. But then, and this, let me give you a little background about me so you understand where I'm coming from. As you heard, after I got out of grad school, I spent 3 years in the Republic of Panama in the Peace Corps. What I did was to basically work for the Catholic bishop there, who was very much into social justice. And he had a wing of the diocese that didn't have anything to do with theology or going to church, none of that stuff, but it was all about economic justice. So we organized subsistence level peasants into cooperatives so that they would have collective power to buy goods, collective power to sell their produce. And so I spent 3 years doing that. So I'm a firm believer in, quote, collective activity. On the other hand, were I a venture capitalist, or as some people say, a vulture capitalist, who went in, looked at companies, busted the company up, sold off the pieces and walked away with a lot of money, employees, too bad. I might have the attitude that, why should my tax dollars go to pay for some some homeless person. Why doesn't that person get a job? Or here's this teenage mom and she's got a kid. Why didn't she keep her legs together back when she was in high school? You know, that kind of a attitude. I personally find that reprehensible. But that's because I guess I'm a collectivist in the sense I think we're all responsible for one another. And not to sound preachy, but at the end of the day, what counts isn't how much money you have in your account, but that you can look back and say, here's what I did, my little bit, so that maybe my town, my state, my country, the world is a better place for me having been here. So I don't agree with his attitude, but that seems to be what motivates him. That's what his antipathy towards unions is.
It's a difference between an oligarchy and a democracy.
And sometimes I wonder about that. You know, there's I guess a train of thought that I always ascribe to the tinfoil hat element, saying that what the governor really wants to do is to wreck the state. He wants to bust AFSCME. He wants the state to go bankrupt so that he can get out from under labor agreements. Why should Catholic Charities be providing these services? There's some company that can do it, some for-profit company that can take over and make money, and investors can make money. Why should we have all these public universities? Why not shut down Eastern, sell it to somebody, and they can run, you know, the Illinois version of Trump U? Why do we have $26 billion going into K-12 education, most of it going to those rotten teachers for the CTU or the IEA or the Illinois Federation of Teachers, and none of it, relatively little of it, going into investors' pockets? If we go with charter schools, and if we bust the teachers' unions, and if Chicago schools go bankrupt, then the private sector can get in there, and some of that $26 billion will go into investors' pockets. Now, that's been suggested that that's what he's driving at. I would hope that's not true, and I would hope that is the wacko element. But you have to wonder sometimes. Any other? If not, thank you very much for. Oh, I'm sorry. No, time out. Another question.
The way the Congress has acted, that and now our governor, that they're very much in the thrall of the libertarians or the bad. You know, all government is bad, all taxes are bad, private enterprises. And one of the key elements is never compromise. That's what we do.
Yeah, that's the notion of starving the beast, where we don't provide the resources and then we don't have to provide these services. There are people who feel that way. There's this whole school of thought, I just said earlier, that if you have problems, it's your own fault. You know, and I find that difficult. To go back to the case of the teenage mom, is it her baby's fault? You know, or someone who's born with a developmental disability, is it that person's fault? Millennia ago, yeah, if you were born with a disability, it's because God was, you know, taking it out on you. As a matter of fact, when I was in Panama, there was an oligarchy that controlled a lot of the economic resources. And what they used to tell the peasants was, well, I have all this money and you don't have anything, but on the other hand, you'll get your reward in heaven. And that used to annoy the dickens out of me. And so we'd work with the people and say, well, you know, you're not destined to be poor. Circumstances you find yourself in might make you poor now, but you can do something about it. So if you get together collectively in this cooperative, you'll maybe be able to have more market influence, maybe do better for yourself. And our bishop was wonderful. There was one of our volunteers was a Cuban American. He was an immigrant who fled Castro, take over the island. And so the rich people, the people at the top, we used to call them Robbie Blancos. would argue, they tell the peasants, don't listen to him because he's a communist. And so finally, this was in a remote area. Bishop went up there and he talked to everybody and he threatened those landowners if they didn't get off Mario's case, he would send them to hell. And the people believed him. I'm not sure the landowners did, but the people believed him. And so they kind of let Mario alone. But yeah, it's a problem that I think the evidence suggests is happening in this country. Most of the economic growth over the last several decades has accrued to a certain element in our society, the folks at the top. Folks in the middle have lost ground. Folks at the bottom are kind of where they've always been, except now there's more of the folks who used to be in the middle are kind of sliding into the bottom. I think that's what fuels a Bernie Sanders. That's what fuels a Donald Trump, to cite two totally dissimilar personalities. But I think that's out there. The electorate feels, a lot of people feel, I'm really getting the shaft. I'm not really sure who's to blame, but I'm angry about it. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but. Well, I want to thank you very much for being patient, listening to me.
Hi, I'm Don Schaefer, Executive Vice President of Midwest Truckers Association. We represent over 2,700 member companies in 15 states who operate in Illinois. These men and women are responsible for keeping the food in your store, the fuel at your gas station, and bringing the books to your schools. In fact, look around the house and virtually everything you see will have been moved at one time or another by a truck. That's why our issues are your issues. Whether it's the taxes they pay, the price of fuel, or the regulations truckers must endure, in the end, you, the consumer, pay the price. That's one reason why I'm proud to serve on the Illinois Channel Advisory Council. Just as truckers deliver the goods on our nation's highways, the Illinois Channel delivers the information you need on your information highway. The Illinois Channel reaches 1.4 million cable homes across the state, as well as making their programming available as a video stream on their website at illinoischannel.org. Delivering the goods is Midwest Truckers' business. Delivering the information you need to stay connected to the actions of state government, that's the Illinois Channel's business. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next from Chicago, we attend a panel at the City Club of Chicago on Chicago's homicide crisis. Speakers include Eddy Johnson, the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, and Reverend Michael Flager, the pastor at St. Sabina's Church. This runs about 50 minutes.
So, Kim, go right ahead, 5 to 7 minutes, and lay out the problem. We all know what it is. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Green. And to be clear, I'm getting the sign that it's 3 to 4 minutes. So I will.
That's right, you're not elected yet. I got it, okay.
And so I know when not to overspeak. Good morning. I think, as Dr. Green has said, that the issues are clear and apparent to not only all of us here in this room, to our city, to the region, but really to the nation, that Chicago is gripped in a crisis as it relates to violence and homicides in our city. That every week, every Monday, today, we get the ticker of how many people have been lost over the weekend, the ticker in terms of age and location. Just last night, sadly, there was a 3-year-old who was shot in the shoulder who is in critical condition as we speak. And so the issue is abundantly clear. We have a rise in homicide. We have a rise in gun violence. And we in the city of Chicago in particular are outpacing other cities of similar sizes as it relates to how we are dealing with our gun violence. Quite frankly, as law enforcement, in particular from the prosecution standpoint, the work that we historically have done is in the aftermath. We deal in a reactionary way to these issues from the state's attorney's standpoint once someone has been arrested and then making the charging decision. But the sad reality is that we cannot deal with the issues of violence in our communities in the aftermath. We must aggressively pursue the constellation of factors that lead to violence in our communities. The overwhelming number of the homicides that are occurring in the city of Chicago are the results of illegal guns. And the fact of the matter is that we're taking off more guns off the street in the aftermath than, again, New York and Los Angeles. And the question becomes, what are we doing in terms of prevention? How do we work to aggressively prevent those who are putting guns in the hands of people who would use them recklessly? The sad reality is that in a number of these neighborhoods where the ticker goes and we hear about the violence, is that it is easier for a young person to get a gun than it is for them to get trauma services to deal with the trauma of living in a war zone. We have high schools in the city of Chicago where we have multiple children who have been killed during the course of 1 year. The trauma associated with that leads to behaviors for young people, and the cycle continues to go. And once we only deal with it after the fact, when that gun is recovered from the scene, it is too late. And so there needs to be a proactive, strategic approach to deal with guns before they get into the hands of those who don't need them. That's part of the problem. We have an issue, and we know that most of the people who are using these guns have obtained them illegally. We know about the lax gun laws of neighboring states. It's not enough to know, we have to do. For those who are engaged in straw purchasing, in the city of Chicago last year, there were 3 arrests, 3 for straw purchasing. There's new legislation that's taken effect that it was just passed down in Springfield that will help give us stronger tools to deal with straw purchasing, but we have to be aggressive in dealing with that. Additionally, we have to ensure that violent repeat offenders are held accountable for their crimes. What we know, and as I'm sure the superintendent will tell you, is that we have a profile of who these folks are who are menacing our communities. And when we go back and we look through their records and see the number of arrests, particularly for violent offenses, and for many for gun offenses, the question becomes, what have we done to prevent their next arrest? In addition to that, we cannot be in isolation looking at guns without looking, again, at the issues related to investment in neighborhoods. We know if we did an overlay of zip codes of where the violence takes its highest toll, and make no mistake that the violence in Chicago has no bounds. There was an article in the Tribune last week that talked about a couple who was on near Lakeshore Drive who were going to go play tennis, and they witnessed a shooting on their way. And they had become to the point where the woman said to the husband, I don't want to look like I'm soft. Let's go play. We are conditioning ourselves to deal with the violence. And in those neighborhoods where the violence has its highest toll, we have to look at the resources that are being allocated, again, not just in the aftermath, but in prevention. And whether that's public health, which gun violence, according to the American Medical Association, is a public health issue and a crisis. And we have to deal with it as a public health crisis in addition to a law enforcement issue. We also have to look at the issues as it relates to the economy and jobs and investment. We also have to look at education. We know for a lot of the young people who are caught up in the cycle of violence that we can identify them as young as the age of 10, whether it's by truancy, whether they have an individualized education plan that has not been dealt with, whether we look at their reading levels, whether we look at the fact that they've been arrested for low-level offenses at the age of 12 and we wait for them to cycle through, that we have to deal with our educational systems, our public health systems, our mental health systems in partnership with the goal of prevention, because enforcement comes after the fact. And so as we look at how we deal with the challenges here in Chicago, again, they are not unique. Homicide rates are rising across the country. But we have a unique opportunity here in Chicago to deal with all the issues at the same time. The piecemeal whack-a-mole approach that we're dealing and thinking that only law enforcement on the back end will solve our problems has failed us thus far. And the urgency of now demands that we do differently and better.
Round of applause. Very well done. Superintendent Johnson, before you go on, by the way, very terse 4 minutes, by the way. You got your BA from Governor State University.
Yes, I did.
Many decades ago, Mr. Alderman Hopkins, you could vouch for it, I started the law enforcement program there. So I take full credit for you, Superintendent. Hold your applause. Superintendent Johnson, go right ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. So I'll just echo some of the statements that Ms. Fox made. So listen, from a police perspective, the only way to make Chicago safer right now is for the community and the police department to work together in doing that. We have to establish a culture of accountability for the police department as well as the residents of this city. So you can't just expect the police to be accountable for their actions. We need the citizens of Chicago to be accountable for their actions also. So how do we do that? We have to rebuild the trust that it takes to make the police department effective. And then while we do that, we also have to hold people accountable for their gun crimes. So in order to do that, we have to restore the trust between the citizens and the police department. The question is, how do we do that? So I think we are in these 2 months, although it does seem like 2 years already. But in these 2 months, I am really encouraged and optimistic about the gains we've made in terms of restoring trust. It's not success yet, but I am seeing progress, and a lot of that is because, we're engaging in town hall meetings with different parts of the city. Because I can tell you all this, I've probably been to roughly 30, somewhere around that, 30 town hall meetings in different places around the city. And the one overarching thing that I'm hearing is, and I mean minority communities, I've been everywhere, listening. Because in order to fix some things, you have to listen to what's ailing people and try to resolve those issues. But at every one of these meetings I go to, the one thing that I always hear people say, without question, is that it's not that they don't want the police in their communities. They just want the police in their communities to be professional, respectful, and treat them fairly. That's what they want. So in order to resolve a lot of the gun violence we have in the city, my challenge is with CPD internally to get us to that point. And we are making strides to get there. How do we do that? We reaffirm CPD's commitment to accountability. So right now, we've established a new Bureau of Professional Standards. That bureau will be responsible for training, dealing with the task force accountability that, the mayor's task force made several recommendations. I think it was 76 of them in all. In 4 months, they did a fantastic job in analyzing things within CPD. So I think they gave us 76 recommendations. When that report came out, within 4 days, we had implemented a third of them. So that shows you that we are serious about changing CPD internally. Because unless the public believes that we are serious about this change, they'll never give us the trust that we need. Because when you hear me say the police is only effective as the trust that the community has in it, I really believe that. The majority of your men and women in blue do want to do the right things. They want to treat the communities respectfully and fairly. Sometimes they get a little bit off track, and it's our job to identify inappropriate behavior early on so we can get that police officer back on track. Now, we have a small subsection that I believe is engaged in inappropriate activity, where there's zero tolerance within CPD for that kind of activity. Those individuals have to know that they will be accountable for their actions. If it's not the type of actions that we deem to be appropriate or professional, then they'll be held accountable for it. And that starts with me down to the last probationary police officer. So this bureau, this new bureau that's been created, they are tasked with the training issues, responding to the Department of Justice recommendations that will be forthcoming, as well as the mayor's task force recommendations. Also, in restoring the public's trust, we have to have a robust communication mechanism and share information and get information. One thing that I've heard time and time again in the minority communities, we will feel more comfortable giving information to people that look more like us. So diversity is what they're asking for, diversity in their police department. And I do think that your police department should reflect you. I do. I think that we're moving in that direction. We had a entry exam not too long ago. The one before that, we made a big push to get minority applicants, and we failed on that. And I think that with CPD, if you fail on something or you do something wrong, it's important that you acknowledge it, fix it, move on. So we failed at that, and the reason we failed at it was because we used information mechanisms that maybe I would use to get information. Print media, television, alderman's office, the elected official's office. That's what we use because that's how we grew up getting our information. These young folks now don't use that stuff, but we found that out the hard way because that particular entry exam, our targeted goal of minority applicants, we failed to reach that goal. So we retooled. We went back out to the communities, talked to them, and listened to them. So this time around, when we gave the entry exam, we used, what do they call it? Snapchat. See? You all didn't know I knew about that, did you? So we use Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, things of that nature to get that information out there to the young people. We still use the other mechanisms, but not to the degree that we had before. But just that little turn in our thinking, which is why you have to be willing to listen to people. Just that little turn in the way we approached it. This last entry exam, 71% of the applicants were minority. 71%. So I think that goes a long way to showing that we're serious about some things. Another category we should hit on with CPD is the community and the relationship building. So we're doing some different things now. My second day that I sat in the seat, I instructed the deputy chief of the training academy to create what's called peace circles. And the way I'm just going to indulge me just for a moment, I want to tell you how I found out about peace circles. After I became superintendent, you're like, okay, what now? Well, I saw two officers in my office area kind of talking and just going through some things. So me being the manager, I said, we don't have time to waste here. There's no crime going on up here. So what are you all doing? So I just kind of peeked at them, and I saw an officer showing my secretary these photos of these groups she had put together. So now, because I'm a police officer, which makes me a nosy person, I said, what is that all about? And she started explaining the idea of peace circles to me. I told the director of the training academy, or the deputy chief, I want to do this, not next year, not next month. I want to do it now. So within a week, he had put together this program. And what peace circles is it takes the police recruits from the academy and partners them up with a minority high school. So in this particular instance, it was Marshall High School. So you took minority students and paired them with police officers. Because I think a lot of the issues between CPD and the communities we serve, you have two different cultures coming together that don't know each other. And when you don't know something, your human tendency is to resist it or fear it. Well, these peace circles help break down that fear between the police and these minority children. It gets these police officers who hadn't dealt with African-American kids before, it gets them to see those kids as kids. Conversely, it lets those kids see these police officers as people also that have the same trials and tribulations that they go through on a daily basis. And it just facilitates dialogue and understanding between the two groups. And I can tell you, last week, I visited one of the peace circles, and I spoke to the officers separately, one at a time, and then I spoke to the students one at a time. Now, the officers, police hate two things, change and the way things are. So they can be a difficult group to navigate. So I really didn't know what to expect from this exchange, but I can tell you all this, and this is why my secretaries accuse me of being a guy where the glass is 3/4 full all the time, not half full, but 3/4, because I look at the positive things all the time, and I'm always optimistic. Well, when I talked to the kids that were participating in this program, so these were juniors and seniors at Marshall High School, black kids, right, that for the most part have had all negative interaction with police, right? So I was really bracing myself when I spoke to these kids, and I talked to each one of them individually. To my amazement, those kids loved this program. So much so that the juniors that were involved in it asked me, could I ensure that we bring the program back to Marshall High School in the fall when they come back to school. So that's a win for us. That's a win. On the police side of it, they were just as equally positive about the program, because some of them told me, I grew up in Park Forest. I never knew. I just thought, when I go into the African American communities, that they were just bad people. And now I have a different perspective, because now they recognize that all kids are not bad. Do we have our challenges and our kids that do need some direction? Yeah, we do. But that's not all of them. So those things are going a long way to help rebuild the trust. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty of it. The violence right now in Chicago is completely unacceptable. We know who's driving it. Like Kim Fox alluded to earlier, we have a what we call a strategic subject list. That list documents people. It's a computer software program that documents who will most likely either be victims of gun violence or the perpetrators of gun violence. It doesn't identify people by race, gender, ethnicity, geographic area, none of that. It just simply looks at the algorithms use things like people that have had contact with police or law enforcement in their background. So let's look at what's been happening. Like she said, Chicago removes more guns than the LAPD and New York PD combined. Think about that for a moment. And that's not because we're that much better than them, because we're not. It's because we have that many more guns out on the streets of Chicago. The CPD from January 1st of this year, this is going to be a really sobering stat that I'm getting ready to give you. But you need to think about it. CPD, since January 1st of this year, has removed one illegal gun per hour every day of this year. So when you think about that, it's completely unacceptable. We have to do a better job of holding people accountable. I told you all Memorial Day weekend is a perfect example of these individuals that we identified on this list. It's a small subsection of Chicago. We have, 2.6 million people in the city right now? We're talking 1,300 to 1,400 individuals that are driving this violence. So this past Memorial Day weekend, we had 66 people shot, right? 80% of those individuals were on this list that I'm talking about, 80%. 100% of the identified offenders from those shootings were on that list. 100%. That tells you right there that we have identified the people most likely to engage in this activity. But what do we do about it? The police department, your police department is, I believe, doing their best. The trust issue between the police and the communities, we're working on that. Rome wasn't built in a day. That's not going to correct itself overnight. So that's a project that we're working on. But we're getting there. We're making some positive strides. But in the meantime, we still have to deal with all these shootings, right?
Superintendent, fear in my voice. Could you wrap it up? We got
Okay, I'm sorry.
Father Flager swinging a couple bats in the on-deck circle, and
So, to put it in a nutshell, this is what we need. We need to hold these individuals accountable. We need our legislative partners to help us and our judicial partners to help us out. So I've been having meetings now with some of our legislative partners to help us get to that end. So the gist of it is we have to do a better job as a city of holding these individuals accountable. And I will turn it over to
Father Mike, you're up.
I'm going to give you my view from 79th Street, where teddy bears and balloons become landmarks, sirens and helicopters become the music of the night, and where oftentimes the presiding emotion is fear. While we sit here on Grand Avenue, we have to understand there is another Chicago. And that Chicago is in a state of emergency. We just looked at this weekend as superintendent with the statistics, 13 killed, some 45 shot this weekend. Too many of our communities are living traumatized. It is unacceptable when parks and porches are empty on summer days because parents are afraid to have their children out. We have a White House campaign talking about exercising, get away from the Xbox, get away from the TV, and go outside and play. Well, that's not an option in some neighborhoods and some communities. We say we don't want violence to become a norm, but the reality is, for many neighborhoods, it is a norm. We see in the other Chicago, we don't hear things on the news like you hear in some other areas when somebody's interviewed about a crime and they say, well, that usually does not happen in our neighborhood. I am so sick and tired of hearing that comment. In other words, it should happen in this section, but it certainly shouldn't happen where we are. In the other Chicago, whole communities are suffering from post-traumatic stress. Too many of our children are becoming roadkill on the streets of Chicago. It is not just the physical lives that are being taken, but they're being killed from fear and sense of abandonment and being disposables and hopelessness that is killing dreams and expectations and hopes and future. The roots of this homicide are deep. And the truth is, violence has become a big business in America, both from the street to politics to the prisons. Carl Stokes, the mayor of Cleveland, once said, we will not address violence in America because we don't want to deal with the defects in America. He was right then, he's right today. If we're going to eradicate this cause of homicide and violence, it is going to demand, I believe, us having the courage to address the depth of the roots of this violence, the roots of underserved and neglected communities that has existed far too long in the city of Chicago, the roots of unequal and disproportionate use of resources, where in one part of the city there's constant building, in another part there's nothing new being built. The roots of quality education still too often depend on your zip code and your race. Education, as Marian Wright Edelman says, usually tells you that someone's not likely to pick up a gun if they have a good education. The roots of double-digit unemployment in some neighborhoods. You look at the neighborhoods where we see most of the violence, we'll see double-digit unemployment. We'll see the most returning from prison with nothing but $20 and a bus card and a bunch of closed doors, and then told, don't come back. The roots of options and opportunities. We hear all the time that Chicago has the largest gang numbers than any urban city in America. If that's true, number one, it says we have failed our children in Chicago that they're going to gangs. But secondly, if they are the largest number, what are we offering as options? If Mike Flager is a gangster disciple and says, I want to turn my life around tomorrow, where does he go? Do we call 911? Do we call 311? What are the options and the opportunities? We have to deal with the roots of broken relationships between community and law enforcement, as the superintendent mentioned. I love this man here and have total confidence in him. But as I said to him the other night on Friday at our march, he has 3 full-time jobs. He has to restore the trust with the community. He has to come up with strategy to deal with violence. And he has to also bring accountability inside the police department of a culture that has not been held accountable. His job is impossible if all these other things around it are not done on the prevention side, so that when he comes in for law enforcement, he's got an equal playing field to come into. We got to deal with the roots of guns. As Kim mentioned, when it's easier to get a gun than it is to get trauma or help or a computer or even a book in our community. We have to deal with this proliferation. We have to deal with these political figures that have been bought by the NRA and refuse to do anything in order to make guns not accessible on the streets of Chicago. We've got to do it nationally, because right now we can have whatever laws we want in Chicago and Illinois, and you can go to Indiana and get whatever you want. And there's no accountability to the person who buys 200 guns and sells them on the streets, and nothing's held responsible to him. We got to deal with guns. We got to deal with churches and synagogues and mosques who, in my business, have given up their right to be the prophetic voices and the moral conscience, and they are now part of the problems of society because they're just worried about the people in their pews and forget that they sit in a non-for-profit, tax-exempt area in their churches, synagogues, and mosques, and they owe the neighborhood from which they come from, and they got to start serving that neighborhood. We've got to deal with the realities that we always ignore in America. And race and segregation is real in America. And guess what? Whoever might be upset by this, the Trump America we're living in now is dangerous. It is dangerous. We now have racism. It's got a second breath from this man. Racism and segregation are on a rise in America, and we better have the courage to deal with it, or we're going to continue to say black communities on the west and the south side that you are disposable and we don't give a damn about you. We owe them the same equal opportunity as every other neighborhood in Chicago. Finally, before he shuts me up, it's also going to demand communities. Communities have to rise up. They have to step up. We have to restore this broken safety net where we don't talk to each other on the block. I said this on Friday night, and I keep saying this every place I go. You can be overwhelmed with the violence in Chicago. But if you just decide I'm going to take care of it in my house and on my block, if everybody just takes care of their block, block by block, we can take back this city. We've got to become the blue lights to look after each other instead of waiting for somebody else to report it and do something about it. But that's going to take with trust. As the superintendent said, that trust has to be built where people can talk. We've got to put parenting back in homes and home structure. Your children are not your friends. Your children are your children. Raise your children and call them to be the trained up children they're supposed to be. We've also got to change the mindset of our young people, not by condemning them and judging them, but by loving them and talking to them and putting our arms around them in our churches and our streets. We have to change the mindset that social media and street credibility are what determines what you do with your life. Social media is a joke, and street credibility lasts till the next person does something on the street. Guns cannot be the first offense or defense in which we handle our problems. But we can't just blame young people doing this on the street because they've learned this from America. In America, what do we do after 9/11? We prayed, and then the next day we bombed the hell out of Iraq. We teach violence in this country all the time. And until we deal with it in America, we're never going to deal with it on the streets of America. We've got to change the mindset of our young people. And not just have gun control, we've got to have mind control. And we've got to teach that. I believe we've got to teach conflict resolution in the police department and in every school, from preschool to senior year of high school. I don't know why that is not a mandatory curriculum with every public school and Catholic school in the city of Chicago. Children have to be taught conflict resolution. Last point.
Go ahead. Don't look at me.
The violence we have is winnable. It is winnable. We have the resources, we have the ability. What we lack, we have the desire, but we lack the will to do the hard things it's going to take than just Band-Aid it or confine it. I am tired of going to meetings with some folks in other parts of the city and say, well, now this violence is coming to my neighborhood. Well, hell yes. Violence has keys. And it's driving everywhere. And don't wait till it gets to your door before you care what happens on the south side and the west side of Chicago. These are citizens of Chicago and deserve the same safety that you have. We also lack the resources, which is why I believe, and this is just me, I'm not speaking for Archbishop Supridge, but I believe that we need to call in the state of Illinois a state of emergency. Let me tell you why. Because the city's broke. The state's broke and dysfunctional. And in downstate Illinois, when a hurricane happens, a tornado happens, what do? We call a state of emergency and resources are brought in. We need to call a state of emergency, not be embarrassed by it, but get the federal resources so Eddy can hire more police, so we can bring in more jobs, so we can redevelop some of our communities that look like they've been hit by a tornado or a hurricane, and bring back to our communities the equal opportunity our children deserve. Thank you.
And some people think oratory is a dead skill, huh? Well done, Father. Ms. Pendleton, I know it's a tough act to follow, but give it a shot.
I was going to say, well, I have nothing to say because you just said everything and very aggressively. Well, thank you all this afternoon for having me here. There are a bunch of mothers in here that I identify. Can you please stand? Thank you. I just kind of want to speak from this perspective. The mothers that are here, that are standing, are very active in the communities. And it's unfortunate that we have to experience issues like this and become active before our voices have weight. I believe that everyone who is within a community, who is a mother of someone, and matter of factly, let me stop before I start talking. Where are the dads that are affected by violence as well? Where are the dads? Please stand. Please stand. Please stand. Thank you. I did that for a reason, because oftentimes the mother's voice is always requested or required, and people want to know how we feel about things since the trauma of losing our children. They always want to know what we're going to do next, if we're going to do anything next, can we do something next, is there a next? And the reality is there isn't a next for everyone. Next sometimes feels selfish, and you feel guilty along the way. And it really requires an ample amount of time, an ample amount of conversation with yourself on a daily basis and with your therapist. I have one. I recommend them for everyone. That, kind of gets you where you need to be. And how I live and structure my life is that God gave me breath, and so every day that I have breath in my body, I am here to be a productive member of society. And however that progressiveness is, or however it is that I can be productive, I am going to do it and figure it out along the way. Not everyone has that ability, and there's a sympathy that needs to be given to families who unfortunately lose their children. They're not in situations where they foresee it happening. I think within our community, and I'm saying the Black and brown community, because very often there's where what we see on TV every day, someone in the Black or brown community, be it West or South Side, that has been affected by violence. I think that we need a resource. I lost my thought just then, but anyway, I think we need a resource to go to who will, afford these families who may not have insurances or otherwise to really see about themselves and to get them on a path of being productive. What I've been doing, and since I haven't been very noisy, is, talking with my son, dealing with myself, dealing with Nate, on the fact that, what's next? We put a lot of love into our 15-year-old daughter who we had great vision for. We thought that right now we would be at college and, inspiring Junior through her actions and her activities. That's what you do. You have your oldest child, you kind of tailor them, get them to where they're going to go. You take the ones that's coming up along the way, and you say, see what they're doing? You could do that. But we don't have that anymore. And a lot of the families in here that I talk about don't have that anymore. And we have to figure out how to redirect that. What once was is now black. And now we have to figure out what new colors to paint in that space with our son that remains. He just graduated 8th grade, by the way. I'm very proud. Yes. And actually, a lot of the mothers in the room just celebrated graduations. Pam Bosley's son is doing some great things, going off to, he's going to college. So he's paving the way for my son. This issue of violence isn't one that just, is our issue. Since it happened to me and affected me directly, my first thought was, oh my God, my bubble was popped. Oh my God, I thought I was safe. I took care of my daughter. I told her what she should do, what she shouldn't do. She doesn't have kids, so I don't have any grandkids. Now I feel different, right? Dang, if I only had a grandchild. Why should I be left with that feeling? Anyway, that's a reality. I'm sorry, I digress. But, we tell them, we teach them right. We implore that they do the right things so that they can be productive. And as they're doing those things, you think, oh, my God, I've done the right thing. I'm on the right path. And then someone else who is minding my business, comes along and they murder our children. So now what does that mean for the rest of our family? We hold them captive. As Pam, her story has been surfacing all around, and she talks about how she keeps her son in the backyard. I'm trying not to keep my son in the backyard. We all have to tackle it differently so that it makes sense to us, so that he has a right to figure out his life and tailor his life. So that's how my story is going. Unfortunately, everyone in here, if you talk to any of the mothers or fathers that stand, they can tell you something different. The question is, what is being done to prevent other people from joining our club? Right. Don't think because you have these jobs that you are exempt. It could be you today. It could be you right now. You just haven't gotten your call yet. That's how real this situation is out here. The issue of guns is real. The NRA should not be so powerful that they control what happens on your block. And that's what they're telling you. They're telling you whether or not you can use your backyard, whether or not you can sit on your front porch, whether or not you should drive down the street. You have people that have a perception of Chicago that is so unreal, but it's real based upon the noise. Our city is beautiful. I love Chicago, but I hate what happened to me here. I am a permanent fixture in the city of Chicago right now. This is how I feel currently, a permanent fixture in the city of Chicago, because I cannot dig up what's buried on 127th Street and carry it with me wherever I should go. So how do I make my residents here in the city of Chicago better? I come to panel discussions like this. I am friend Dr. Father Flager, and I try to talk to people who are in positions of power that I think can do things that can make our way better. And that's what all of us are doing in here. We're sitting here, we want to know how to fix it. We're looking for someone to tell us how to fix it. But guess what? You already knew that before you walked in. There's nothing new you're going to learn here today. And I say that only because I've only been here talking to people on panels for 3 years. And the discussion is the same. Right. What's gotten worse is the shootings. The guns were illegal 3 years ago. They're still illegal today. The amount of guns and the usage of it, that should tell us that there is something that is wrong within our school system, as Father Flager alluded to. There are, especially on the South Side, and especially in our Black and brown communities, there are so many things like ethics, things like that should be taught. Issue conflict resolution. I'm so pissed at you that I just want to shoot you and kill you. Do you guys remember fist fights? Has anyone heard of a fist fight lately? Like, seriously, and the sad part is social media perpetuates the embarrassment. So it used to be you and about 5 people, 6 people, whoever knew the fight was going to happen. You get your little butt whooped. You feel so embarrassed. Oh, my God, what am I going to do? That never happened to me, though. Okay, don't try me. But, it was just a couple people. Now that happens, someone's taping it instead of breaking it up. Someone's, posting it before you can resolve the issue. No one's telling these young people and young adults, what's right, what's wrong. And so I think that it is a situation out here that is really sad, to be perfectly honest. It's really sad that we all have to figure out how to rebuild our lives. Some of us have more children, some of us don't. How to figure out how to rebuild our lives ourselves and then all of the community. So I think everyone in here needs to take a responsibility, a role, an active role, and figure out, you know, if you are up north and it's working right for you up there, what is it that's working up north that couldn't be working down out south or out west? Who is it that I could talk to and share something that I am doing with on the south and west side so we can make these areas better? These young people are not all broken and messed up. These young people are without resources and opportunity. If they had those, they would make different and better decisions. And that is all. Thank you.
We have a number of questions. We have more questions than we could possibly ask. And we're going into OT. Madam President, is that okay?
Yes, of course.
Yes, okay. We'll go to 1:30. Okay, here we go. First question. This is from Rufus Williams, Better Boys Foundation, Family Services. Still Better Boys Foundation, isn't it?
Well, it used to be. That's why it's BBF Family Services.
All right, well, remember, I'm from the old neighborhood too, so I don't know. Here's a question. This is for you, Superintendent. You have stated that 1,300 known people are primarily responsible for the havoc in our streets. Is this a rolling number? What keeps CPD from dealing with them?
Okay, well,
kind of a direct question, but
yeah, it fluctuates somewhere between 1,300 and 1,400 individuals, and the reason that CPD can't just deal with them directly is because, as I said before, the algorithms that are used, they still have to commit a crime. It's simply based on what they've done in the past, but we still have to be mindful of people's civil rights. So we can't, if I see one of them right on the street, I can't just go up to them and start questioning them about things, because we still have to be mindful of their civil rights. So what we do, because we know who they are, we'll knock on their doors and offer them resources and services to get them back on the right track if they choose to go that direction. And some of them have accepted our assistance, but that's why we can't just lock them up, because they still have to break the law before we can arrest them.
Okay. Next question comes from, and I don't know, I'm sure this is Marsha Lee, Purpose Over Pain. Are you here, Marsha? Yes. Oh, right over there. This is for you, Kim. Regarding unsolved murders in Illinois, we have cases that have pertinent info, but state's attorney has not moved on or brought to a grand jury. What will you do to have more cases? What will you do to move these cases forward?
Thank you, Marsha. The sad reality is that the homicide closure rate in the city of Chicago is horrifically low, and that there are parents like Marsha who has lost her son, who there's information that's presented, and the way it works here in Cook County, just for context, is that information is presented by the police departments, whether it's City of Chicago or Harvey, to the state's attorney's office in what they call their felony review unit. And felony review is to look at the evidence that's presented, whether there's a confession, whether there's fingerprints or DNA or any of that nature, put together to determine whether or not there's sufficient evidence to make a charge in those cases. And what we found, even before it gets to the point of presentation to the state's attorney's office, is that there's a conclusion reached that we don't have enough evidence in which to close those cases. And what then happens is we look at the statistics of the number of people who are shot and killed, but we don't see a correlation between the number of people who are then prosecuted for those crimes. And the sad reality is, in a number of jurisdictions or a number of our suburban districts and the city of Chicago, we have a frustration between the community and law enforcement and the state's attorney's office about not charging those cases and making sure that the decision to charge those cases or not charge those cases is based on the sufficiency on the evidence and not necessarily the guarantee of conviction. And that's where we sometimes see a breakdown. These cases are difficult. Most homicides are not caught on videotape. It's not like CSI where fingerprints are there and you can use a black light. There's a lot where we deal with circumstantial evidence, and that's all we've got. And that's the best that we'll be able to get to do. And we need to have our law enforcement and our state's attorney's office look at the sufficiency of that evidence. And even in those cases in which you wish you had more, the question is, do you have enough? And when you have enough, you should move forward on those cases.
Okay. Here's a question, a general question. I think Father Mike will throw it at you. This is from Jane Johnson, City Club member. Jane, where are you? Are you the former high school principal? No, different Jane. I'm not a youngster anymore. All right, here's the question, Father. I was a child in Chicago 40 years ago. It was bullying and gangs then, and I can still remember my neighbors calling their children to come to play in front of the house when that evening light came on. Besides the guns, what's happened to our youth in this day and age? Is there any hope left?
Oh, my God.
You could use them if you like. Go ahead.
I'm a minister, so I'm a prisoner of hope. Unless God tells me he quit, I don't quit. But the other part of it is this, is that, I think we can say, what's happened to our youth? Back up. What's happened to our society? We're a society. I mean, look at this election. I'm ashamed to be an American right now. I'm ashamed to be an American, to think that somebody with views that a Trump has, and I'm going to get in trouble with this, I know, is risen to the office of possibly becoming President of the United States. But why has it gotten to that? Because the fact of the matter is that he's exposed a whole lot of America that we want to pretend doesn't exist. And they're real, and they're there, and they're strong. And they have risen up because now they have a mouthpiece. So, when we say what's wrong with the youth, I say what's wrong with the adults. What's wrong with this country? What's wrong with our society? Because the children are purely products of a society we've birthed, and now we have to be held accountable for.
Well, we have several questions along the same line, and this will be a free jump ball. This is from Pam Bosley. Is that the ma'am? Is that okay? Also, purpose over pain. If this is, I guess, to you start off, Superintendent. I think it's pretty much like the previous one. Maybe you could expand. If CPD knows who the shooters are, why are the shooters still on the streets? And do the blue lights work? If so, who watches the cameras? There is no way we should have all these unsolved cases where all of the blue lights cameras within our community.
Okay, thanks for that question, Pam. Yeah, as I said before, the reason why those shooters are still there is for two reasons. We've identified them, but again, CPD can't just go pluck them off the street until they actually do something that we can arrest them for. But even further than that, the system of accountability is broken. You know, these guys are repeat gun offenders, repeat. So a lot of them, like there's a guy that I have in front of me right now. He's been arrested 5 times. He got 8 years, 1 year, 6 years, 4 years, 120 days, all for UUW offenses. That's illegal weapons, where he's used them in attempt robberies or just shot someone. He got all that time in prison, right? But he didn't spend that much in there. So what was the end result? He got murdered not too long ago because we've identified him as being one of those individuals. So we have to have our legislators help us with this situation and strengthen our mandatory sentencing as far as gun crimes go. Because if you're willing to pick up a gun, then you're willing to use it. Otherwise, why pick it up? So that's one of the things we have to work on in terms of the blue light cameras. Chicago's camera system, I think the only people that have a more exhaustive camera system is Israel, a country, and I believe London, Paris. The problem isn't that we don't have enough cameras. Quite naturally, we have thousands of cameras. I think 20-some thousand cameras out there. So clearly, we can't have someone looking at all of those cameras. The issue becomes, and the blue light cameras do work. The problem is, unless somebody takes control of it, it's designed to pan around. So it might catch something right before something happens, and then it pans away from it. So it's just impossible to figure out a way to know that camera is going to catch that particular action every time. But we have had some positive results from the cameras, but that's not everything that we need. And believe me, criminals, they take notice of those cameras, so they do certain things away from the cameras, and I think there's a misnomer that a lot of those cameras don't work, but they do. They work, and we do glean some evidence from them.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.